Think about this for a second. Global greenhouse gas emissions went up by 1.3% in 2023.
Hmm.
Now, that number on its own, maybe it doesn't mean much, but when you realize that's higher than the average increase before the pandemic, it raises some serious questions, doesn't it?
It really does.
What's really going on with our emissions and, what are the crucial details behind that headline that you need to know? That's exactly what we're diving into today.
Right. We're embarking on a deep dive into the Emissions Gap Report 2024. And this isn't just like a casual opinion piece.
Yeah.
It's a comprehensive scientific assessment put together by UNEP, drawing on the expertise of 58 leading scientists from 40 institutions across 18 different countries.
Wow, that's quite a team.
Yeah, so you can think of this as a really solid, independent, science-based snapshot of where we stand. Our goal today is, to cut through the complexity and bring you the core insights.
Absolutely. For you, our listener, we want to extract the vital knowledge from this report. We want you to understand this emissions gap, the difference between where our current path is taking us and where we need to be to meet climate goals.
Mm-hmm.
We'll look at the progress being made, or perhaps more accurately, the lack thereof, and explore the potential routes forward. We know you're busy, you don't have time to wade through hundreds of pages, so we're here to be your expert guides, focusing on what truly matters, especially as countries gear up for the next round of nationally determined contributions, or NDCs.
Right, the NDCs.
The report makes it clear these are, they're a pivotal moment.
Totally pivotal. So
Yeah.
Let's get right into the current state of play then. That 1.3% increase pushed us to a record high of 57.1 gigatons of CO2 equivalent in 2023.
57.1 gigatons, that's a lot.
It is, and what's particularly interesting when you dig into the sectors responsible is that power generation making electricity, it remains the biggest piece of the pie, contributed 15.1 gigatons.
Still the biggest, huh?
Yeah.
Even with renewables picking up.
Yeah, you might think it'd be shifting faster, right? Transport is also a significant contributor at 8.4 gigatons, and then agriculture and industry are tied, about 6.5 gigatons each.
Okay. And when we look at where the growth is happening, some of it, I guess, makes sense, like the world reopening.
Exactly. International aviation, after the pandemic slump, saw a massive 19.5% jump, almost a full rebound, really.
19.5%.
Yeah. But beyond that, we also saw rapid growth in maybe less obvious areas. Fugitive emissions, think of, like leaks from oil and gas infrastructure and coal mines.
The methane leaks and stuff.
Precisely. As well as road transportation and emissions from energy-related industries, all those grew at rates above 2.5% in 2023.
Okay. So growth across the board, basically.
Pretty much. And if we connect this to a fundamental question of fairness, the report highlights some really stark differences in per capita emissions globally.
Right. The individual footprint.
Exactly. To put it in perspective for you, the average person in the USA or Russia emits about 3 times more greenhouse gases than the global average, which is around 6.6 tons of CO2 equivalent per year.
3 times the global average.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then contrast that with, say, the African Union, India, and least developed countries, where per person emissions are significantly lower.
Big difference.
Huge. And it's not just about where these emissions are produced geographically either. The report also emphasizes inequalities based on consumption patterns,
Yeah.
what we're all buying and using, regardless of where it's made.
Right. So our individual consumption habits play a big role no matter where we live. Okay. Now, the report also delves into LULUCF, that's land use change, and forestry. Interestingly, there was a reported 6.5% decrease in CO2 emissions from this sector globally in 2023.
Yeah, using what's called a global bookkeeping approach. But the report also flags some significant uncertainties and complexities here.
Okay, so a decrease. But with caveats, what are the complexities?
Well, what's fascinating here, and perhaps a bit confusing for listeners, is that this global bookkeeping approach for LULUCF, it gives a different picture than the national inventory approach that countries themselves use for their reporting.
Different accounting methods.
Exactly. The bookkeeping method primarily looks at direct human-induced changes like deforestation. National inventories, on the other hand, often include both direct and indirect effects, like increased vegetation growth on managed lands because there's more CO2 in the atmosphere.
The CO2 fertilization effect.
Right. So this difference in what's being counted leads to quite different estimates of emissions and removals from the land sector. It just makes it challenging to get a clear, unified global picture,
Yeah, I can see that.
It really underscores the difficulty in accurately tracking how our land use is impacting the climate.
So even when we see a seemingly positive trend, like that decrease in LELUCF emissions, the way we're measuring it can really shape our understanding. Okay, let's shift our focus then to the nationally determined contributions, the NDCs. These are the commitments countries make under the Paris Agreement. What's the latest update on these crucial pledges?
Well, this brings us to a critical point about the ambition and pace of climate action. The report points out a pretty concerning trend. The momentum in strengthening these NDCs has really stalled since the initial round of submissions.
Stalled. How so?
By September 2024, remarkably few countries, only 3 had submitted new or updated NDCs. And of those, only Madagascar actually put forward a stronger emissions reduction target for 2030.
Only 3. And only one with a stronger target. That's not...
Not great at all. This lack of progress comes despite, repeated calls and increasing scientific evidence highlighting the urgent need for more ambitious action.
So why the plateau? Any ideas from the report?
It could be a mix of factors, really. Maybe geopolitical tensions, domestic economic pressures, or simply a lack of sufficient political will in some of the major emitting nations.
Right.
Whatever the reasons, this stagnation has real consequences for our ability to meet those climate goals.
That definitely doesn't sound like the kind of rapid progress we urgently need.
Hmm.
So given this plateau, what's the overall impact of the current NDCs on our emissions trajectory?
Okay, so if we take all the current unconditional and conditional NDCs together, the report estimates they would lead to a reduction of around 5.0 to 5.3 gigatons of CO2 equivalent in global emissions by 2030, compared to what emissions were projected to be before these initial pledges.
Okay, so some reduction compared to doing nothing.
Some reduction, yes. But here's the sobering part for you. This estimated reduction is very similar to what last year's report projected.
Ah, so no real improvement in the last year.
Exactly, because, as we just discussed, there haven't been many significant updates or increases in ambition in the NDCs over the past year. So that gap between where we are and where we need to be, it isn't really shrinking.
So despite all the talk and the reports, we're not seeing a significant increase in ambition actually translating into bigger emissions cuts on a global scale yet.
On a slightly more positive note, the report does mention some encouraging trends within the newer NDCs themselves, doesn't it?
Yes, it does. There are some positive developments in the quality of the NDCs, you could say. What's encouraging is that more and more countries are including economy-wide GHG reduction targets in their pledges.
Ah, so covering the whole economy, not just bits and pieces.
Right. It means they're committing to reducing emissions across their entire economy, not just, say, the power sector. Additionally, a larger proportion of these new targets are expressed as absolute reductions compared to a specific base year, which makes progress easier to track.
Okay, that's good. Clearer targets. Yeah. And the report also highlights that an increasing number of NDCs now cover all greenhouse gases, not just CO2. This aligns with the encouragement from the first global stocktake for more comprehensive and ambitious targets. It's definitely a move towards a more holistic approach.
That makes sense. You can't just focus on CO2 when methane and other gases are also major problems, right?
Exactly.
Now let's talk about the big players, the G20 nations. Given they account for, what, over 3/4 of global emissions?
The massive 77% in 2023, yeah.
So what's their situation looking like in terms of meeting these goals?
Well, within this group, we saw some concerning trends last year. Emissions increased in China, India, and Russia.
Increases in those major economies.
Yes. While the EU and the USA did manage to show decreases, Brazil's emissions remained roughly the same. However, and this is a crucial point for you to understand, the report highlights that many G20 members are currently not even on track to meet their existing NDC targets based on the policies they have in place right now.
Wait, so they're not even on track for the promises they've already made?
That's right. There's a real disconnect between the promises on paper and the action on the ground, an implementation gap, as they call it.
That sounds like a pretty significant implementation gap. Can the report, quantify that at all?
It can, yeah. The report estimates that if we were to replace the emission projections based on the G20's NDC targets with projections based on their current implemented policies, well, the collective implementation gap would widen to about 1.9 gigatons of CO2 equivalent.
1.9 gigatons. That's not insignificant.
Not at all. That's a substantial amount of emissions that aren't being addressed by current actions. And when you look at per capita emissions within the G20, the projected reduction by 2030 under their NDCs is only marginally lower than what's expected under their current policies.
So even with the pledges, the actual impact on individual emissions in these major economies isn't very significant in the near term. term.
Pretty much, yeah.
So even with these national commitments, the everyday emissions per person in these powerful countries aren't projected to drop much. What about their longer-term ambitions, like those net zero targets we hear so much about?
Good question. The report notes that 9 G20 members have now set legally binding net zero targets, which is definitely a positive step.
Legally binding, okay.
And 12 G20 members have published some form of implementation plan outlining how they intend to reach these goals. However, the crucial detail here, and where a lot of uncertainty remains, is that most of these implementation plans still lack concrete details, specific milestones, and the necessary short-term actions to actually put them on track.
So the long-term goal is there, but the roadmap is fuzzy for many.
Very fuzzy for many. Only a few, like those from the EU, France, and the UK, provide a relatively high level of detail about the pathways they intend to take. And remember, reaching net zero requires emissions to peak soon and at a low level. So this needs to be a near-term priority for countries whose emissions haven't peaked yet.
Right, you can't just set a 2050 target and wait until 2045 to start acting.
Absolutely not.
Okay, so we've got a clearer picture of where global emissions are, what countries are pledging, and the gaps in those pledges. Now, let's get to the heart of the matter, the emissions gap itself. How does the report define it this year, and what does it tell us about the size of that gap?
Right, the emissions gap. Simply put, it's the difference between the emissions levels we are projected to reach if all current NDCs are fully implemented, and the emissions levels that are consistent with the least cost pathways to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees C and 2 degrees C, those Paris Agreement goals.
Okay, the gap between promises and what's needed.
Exactly. And what this year's report really underscores for you is the critical impact of the time we've lost since 2020. These delays in taking more decisive action are making it increasingly difficult to achieve the deep and rapid emission reductions needed by 2030 to keep those temperature limits within reach.
So the delay makes the climb steeper.
Much steeper. The longer we wait, the steeper and potentially more disruptive the necessary cuts become.
So it's like delaying saving for retirement. The longer you wait, the more you have to save each month to catch up. What are the actual emission projections looking like for 2030 based on the report?
Okay, under current policies, what countries are actually doing right now? Global greenhouse gas emissions in 2030 are projected to be around 57 gigatons of CO2 equivalent. There's a range, of course, 53 to 59 gigatons.
57 gigatons. And how does that compare to last year's projection?
It's actually a slight increase compared to what was projected in last year's assessment, which is concerning.
An increase, despite everything.
Yeah. Now, if we look at the scenarios where countries fully implement their NDCs, unconditional NDCs would lead to around 54 gigatons.
Okay, a bit better.
A bit. And if we include the conditional NDCs, those that depend on receiving finance or other support, that figure drops slightly more to 51 gigatons.
So 51 gigatons in the most optimistic current pledge scenario. How does that stack up against the 1.5 or 2 degree goals?
Well, that's the gap, isn't it? Even in the best case scenario, where every country fully delivers on its current promises, we're still significantly above where we need to be to have a reasonable chance of meeting those Paris Agreement temperature goals.
Right, okay. The report also touches on the possibility of global emissions peaking soon. Given the record high in 2023, is there any indication that we might be at that turning point? Or near it?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? While global emissions did reach a new record in 2023, they do appear to be leveling off somewhat. Whether 2023 was the absolute peak or if it's just around the corner, well, that hinges on a complex interplay of factors.
Such as?
A key factor will be the speed at which major developing economies like China and India can deploy clean technologies to meet their growing energy demands without increasing their reliance on fossil fuels. That's huge.
Right. Can they leapfrog?
Exactly. Simultaneously, regions like Europe, which have already seen their emissions peak, need to not only maintain but actually accelerate those reductions beyond just decarbonizing their electricity sectors.
So the peaked regions need to go faster too.
Yes. And then there are unexpected climate-related events, like droughts impacting hydropower generation, which can also throw a wrench in the works, forcing more fossil fuel use temporarily.
It sounds like a delicate balance, with progress in some areas potentially being offset by challenges in others.
Yeah.
Were there any specific positive signs the report highlighted for 2024?
Yes, there are some glimmers of hope. Global renewable energy capacity saw very strong growth in 2023, and early data suggests an even faster expansion in 2024.
Oh, that's good news.
Particularly in wind and solar in major economies like China, the EU, and the USA. We've also seen reports of a decrease in China's fossil CO2 emissions in the second quarter of 2024, and the share of coal in their power generation reportedly hit a record low.
China's coal use hitting a record low share. That seems significant.
It really could be. If these trends persist, there's a possibility that China's fossil CO2 emissions, being the world's largest single contributor, might have indeed peaked in 2023. That would be a major milestone.
That would certainly be a major step forward. But you mentioned it's not all good news on that front. There were some counteracting factors.
No, unfortunately, not all good news. The latest data also suggests that global power sector emissions might not fall as much as previously anticipated in 2024.
Why is that?
It seems to be largely due to a surge in electricity demand, driven by both economic growth in some regions and the increasing frequency and intensity of heat waves globally. That leads to higher demand for cooling, air conditioning.
Climate change itself driving up emissions. A feedback loop.
Exactly. This increased demand could potentially slow down the peaking of overall fossil fuel use and emissions. Furthermore, outlooks for oil and gas demand still point to continued growth in 2024, and worrying trends in methane emissions indicate they are still accelerating.
Methane still accelerating. That's not good.
Not at all. So while there are positive signals, the overall picture remains complex, and the path to peaking global emissions isn't yet definitively clear.
Okay, so we're seeing some tentative steps in the right direction, maybe, but there are also significant headwinds. Looking ahead then to the next round of NDCs, what level of ambition does the report indicate is absolutely necessary?
The report is very direct on this. To have a reasonable chance of staying below 2 degrees of warming, global greenhouse gas emission projections for 2035 need to be at least 37% below 2019 levels.
37% below 2019 by 2035 for 2 degrees.
Okay, and to aim for the more ambitious 1.5 degree C pathway, that reduction needs to be a staggering 57% compared to 2019.
57%, wow.
Yeah. The report strongly emphasizes the critical importance of taking substantial action before 2030 to make these kinds of deep reductions feasible.
So the next few years are absolutely crucial.
Absolutely. If we don't manage to get global emissions significantly below current policy and fully implemented NDC levels by 2030, achieving 1.5 degrees C, even with a limited amount of overshoot, becomes incredibly difficult. And even limiting warming to 2 degrees C will be a much more formidable challenge.
Those are really stark numbers. It highlights just how much we need to accelerate our efforts in the very near future. Now, the report also delves into the concept of fair share when it comes to tackling emissions reductions. This can be a really complex and politically sensitive area. How does the report approach this idea of who should do what?
It does indeed. The report introduces two primary frameworks for thinking about how to distribute the effort of reducing emissions: cost effectiveness and fair share principles.
Okay, cost effectiveness versus fair share. What's the difference?
Well, the cost effectiveness approach focuses on identifying and implementing emission reductions in the most economically efficient way, basically, wherever those reductions can be achieved at the lowest cost globally.
So just find the cheapest cuts, regardless of who does them.
Essentially, yes. But this approach is often criticized because it doesn't necessarily consider historical responsibilities or the varying capacities of different countries to act, the equity side.
Right. Which brings us to fair share.
Exactly. Fair share principles aim to allocate mitigation responsibilities more equitably. They take into account factors like a country's historical contribution to greenhouse gas emissions, their current economic and technological capabilities, and their specific developmental needs.
That makes sense intuitively. Countries that have been emitting for longer and have greater resources likely have a different responsibility than those with a smaller historical footprint and fewer resources. But trying to actually define and implement fair share sounds like a real challenge in practice.
Oh, it is incredibly challenging. Defining what constitutes a truly fair allocation of responsibility is inherently complex. The concept of equity itself has many dimensions, and any specific formula involves ethical considerations and value judgments.
Yeah, how do you weigh historical responsibility versus current capacity, for example?
Precisely. As you mentioned, various equity principles are considered. Historical responsibility, who contributed most to the problem historically. Current capability, who has the economic and technological means to act now. And developmental needs, ensuring that climate action doesn't hinder poverty reduction and sustainable development. It's a tough balancing act.
Definitely. And you mentioned LULUCF is excluded here.
Yes, that's important. The report's analysis in this fair share section specifically excludes emissions and removals from the land use sector, LULUCF, just due to the significant complexities in aligning and allocating those across different countries based on these varying principles. It gets very messy.
Okay, so it's focusing on the more direct emissions from things like energy and industry to try and establish these principles. Given these different ways of thinking about responsibility, what does the report say about the role of the G20 nations in achieving these fair share reductions?
Well, the report is quite clear. The G20 nations, as the source of the vast majority of global emissions, collectively need to achieve emission reductions at a faster rate than the global average.
Faster than average. That makes sense, given they emit the most.
Right. And that holds true regardless of whether you're looking through the lens of cost effectiveness or fair share principles. If we are to align with pathways that limit warming to 1.5 degrees C,
Can they put a number on that? How much faster?
they quantify it, yes. The median cost-effective reductions needed by the G20 as a whole would be around 38% by 2030 and 55% by 2035, both relative to their 2019 emission levels.
38% by 2030, 55% by 2035, relative to 2019 for the G20.
Okay. This really underscores the significant responsibility these major economies bear in driving global climate action.
Those are substantial cuts required for the G20. Does the report offer any specific examples of what might be achievable for individual countries within that group, to kind of bring it down to earth?
Yes, it provides a few illustrative examples. For China, based on national modeling, it appears feasible to achieve at least a 10% reduction in CO2 emissions by 2030 and somewhere in the range of 28% to 37% by 2035 relative to their emissions in recent years or their peak emission year.
Okay, 10% by 2030 for China, potentially more by 2035?
For the USA, a more bottom-up assessment, looking at the potential of existing and plausible policies, suggests the possibility of a 65% net reduction in all greenhouse gases by 2035 compared to their 2005 levels.
65% for the U.S. by 2035 relative to 2005. That's ambitious, aligning with their current goals.
It is. And Brazil presents a particularly interesting case because, as we touched on with LULUCF, the estimated reduction for 2035 varies dramatically depending on whether emissions and removals from the land use sector are included.
Ah, right. How big's the difference?
In a scenario where Brazil meets its 2030 NDC and achieves net zero by 2050, the projected reduction by 2035 is around 60% with LULUCF accounted for, but only about 2% without LULUCF.
50% versus 2%. That's a massive difference.
Massive. It really highlights the critical importance of addressing deforestation and promoting sustainable land use in Brazil's overall mitigation efforts. It's central for them.
Those country-specific examples really bring to life the diverse challenges and opportunities different nations face. Okay. Now, to actually close this emissions gap, it's obvious we need significant transformations across many sectors of our economy and society. What kind of sectoral shifts and potentials does the report emphasize?
Yeah, the report stresses that we need simultaneous and rapid transformations across all key sectors: energy, agriculture, and land use, AFOU, transport, industry, and buildings. It's not just one thing.
All hands on deck.
Exactly. And the recent global stocktake outcome, which you might recall from COP, specifically called for some ambitious global targets. Things like tripling the capacity of renewable energy sources.
Right. Tripling renewables.
Doubling the rate of energy efficiency improvements, phasing down unabated coal power, transitioning away from all fossil fuels in a just and orderly manner, and protecting and restoring ecosystems.
Those big global goals from the stocktake.
Yes. And these calls really highlight the scale and scope of the changes needed across the board.
Those are certainly ambitious goals that touch almost every aspect of modern life. Does the report provide any specific benchmarks or targets for what these sectorial transformations should look like by certain dates, like 2030 or 2035?
Yes, it does. The report includes a table outlining sectoral benchmarks that are aligned with a 1.5 degrees C warming pathway. They've got specific, time-bound targets for both 2030 and 2035.
Okay, so concrete numbers for sectors.
Yeah, these benchmarks are intended to illustrate the necessary pace and scale of change required in each sector. For instance, they indicate the rate at which we need to phase down fossil fuels and scale up renewable power.
And how are we doing against those benchmarks?
Well, unfortunately, the report also notes that global progress against the majority of these critical benchmarks is currently quite limited. It underscores the urgent need to accelerate action pretty much everywhere.
That's a bit concerning to hear that we're not even on track in most sectors according to these 1.5 degree aligned goals. But the report must also identify areas where there's significant potential for reducing emissions, right? Where can we make big gains?
Absolutely. And the good news here is that the report highlights substantial techno-economic emission reduction potential across various sectors using technologies that are already available today. We have the tools, largely.
Okay, that's encouraging. What are the biggest areas of potential?
Remarkably, just the further deployment of solar photovoltaic, PV, and wind energy accounts for a huge portion of this potential, estimated at 27% of the total reduction needed in 2030 and 38% in 2035.
Wow, over a third just from solar and wind by 2035 potential.
Huge potential there. In the forestry sector, reducing deforestation, actively engaging in reforestation, and implementing improved forest management practices offer another very significant potential chunk.
Stopping deforestation and planting trees, basically.
Right. And beyond the energy supply side, demand-side measures across all sectors using less stuff, basically, along with improvements in energy efficiency, electrification of end uses, and switching to cleaner fuels in buildings, transport, and industry. They also hold considerable promise.
So efficiency and using less energy are key, too.
Definitely. The report estimates that the total techno-economic emission reduction potential, considering technologies that cost less than US $200 per ton of CO2 equivalent abated, is actually large enough to bridge the emissions gap in both 2030 and 2035.
So technically and economically, it's possible to close the gap with existing stuff.
Yes, but again, realizing the potential hinges on overcoming significant policy, governance, institutional, and technical barriers that are currently hindering widespread implementation.
Right, the potential is there, but the roadblocks are real.
Very real.
So the solutions are largely there, but the challenge lies in putting them into practice at the scale and speed required. Let's delve a bit deeper into some of these key sectors. Starting with the energy sector, what are the critical benchmarks and the major areas of potential there?
Okay, for the energy sector, the overarching benchmark is a swift and decisive transition away from fossil fuels and a massive scaling up of electricity generation from zero carbon sources, primarily renewables.
Phase out fossil fuels, scale up renewables, got it.
The report emphasizes that the phase out of both coal and natural gas needs to happen much faster than current trends suggest. Much faster.
Faster than we're seeing now.
Yes. On a more optimistic note, some countries, like Greece and the UK, have demonstrated that rapid coal phase-out is indeed achievable. It can be done.
Okay, so there are positive examples. Where's the biggest potential? Still solar and wind.
Yes. The primary mitigation potential in this sector lies in the continued and accelerated deployment of solar, PV, and wind power. Additionally, there's a significant opportunity to reduce methane emissions from the production and transport of fossil fuels, tackling those fugitive emissions we talked about.
Right, plugging the leaks.
Exactly. To fully unlock this potential, however, we'll need substantial investments in grid infrastructure to handle the variability of renewable energy. Plus, the development and deployment of demand response mechanisms and energy storage solutions, batteries, etc.
Grid upgrades and storage, key enablers.
Okay.
And what about the industrial sector? That often feels like a particularly difficult area to decarbonize.
Yeah.
All that heat, chemical processes.
It is challenging, no doubt. Transforming the industrial sector will require a multi-pronged approach. Key strategies include lowering overall consumption through improved material efficiency and embracing circular economy principles.
Using less material, recycling more.
Right. Substituting traditional high-emission materials like cement with more advanced, lower-emission alternatives, significantly improving energy efficiency across industrial processes, electrifying processes where feasible.
Switching from burning fuel to using clean electricity.
Exactly. Utilizing green hydrogen for industries where direct electrification is challenging, and deploying carbon capture, utilization, and storage, CCUS technologies, in specific, hard-to-abate subsectors.
Okay, a whole toolkit needed for industry. Now let's turn to agriculture, forestry, and other land use the AFOLU sector. Given its dual role as both a source and a sink of greenhouse gases, this seems particularly crucial to address effectively.
Absolutely. It's complex but critical. The benchmarks for the AFOLU sector include urgently halting deforestation and the loss of critical ecosystems like peatlands and mangroves.
Stop cutting down forests and draining wetlands.
Yes. Actively undertaking reforestation and ecosystem restoration efforts. Reducing the overall greenhouse gas intensity of agricultural practices, things like methane from livestock or nitrous oxide from fertilizers.
Making farming less polluting.
Right. minimizing food loss and waste throughout the supply chain, and promoting shifts towards more sustainable and less emissions-intensive diets, particularly in high-consuming regions.
Eating less meat, basically, in places that eat a lot of it, and reducing food waste.
Those are key parts of it, yes. The report notes that current global efforts in many of these areas are not on track, unfortunately. But it also highlights some positive examples, such as the recent encouraging reductions in forest loss observed in Brazil and Colombia.
Ah, so some progress in South America on deforestation.
Some encouraging signs, yes. Significant mitigation potential in this sector lies in preventing deforestation in the first place, expanding afforestation and reforestation initiatives, and implementing improved and more sustainable forest management practices. Demand-side measures related to food consumption also offer considerable potential.
But you mentioned barriers earlier for FOU.
Yes, significant barriers remain. Things like insufficient financial support and investment, the presence of harmful subsidies that incentivize unsustainable practices, a lack of viable economic alternatives for farmers in some regions, and challenges related to policy implementation and enforcement.
Sounds familiar. Money, policy, alternatives.
Exactly. Key enablers include supportive and well-designed policies, increased financial flows, effective technology transfer, strengthened governance structures, and secure land tenure rights, especially for indigenous communities.
Secure land rights are important.
Very. The report also emphasizes that the funding gap for climate action in the AFLU sector is particularly large and needs to be addressed urgently.
Big funding gap in land use.
Okay. And what about the transport sector? So ingrained in our daily lives and economies. Cars, trucks, planes, ships.
Right. The benchmarks in the transport sector involve a significant shift towards more sustainable modes of transportation. This includes increasing the availability and use of rapid public transit systems and dedicated infrastructure for cycling and walking.
More buses, trains, bike lanes, less reliance on cars.
Exactly. Actively working to reduce overall private car travel and achieving a rapid increase in the sales and overall fleet share of electric vehicles across all categories: cars, 2- and 3-wheelers, buses, trucks.
Electrify everything that moves.
Pretty much. The report specifically highlights China's leading role in the current uptake of electric vehicles. They're way ahead in sales volume.
Right. China's EV market is huge. Where's the main potential in transport? The primary mitigation potential comes from the transition to electric vehicles and road transport. But there are also important contributions to be made through efficiency improvements and the adoption of low and zero-emission fuels in shipping and aviation. Think sustainable aviation fuels or ammonia hydrogen for ships.
Harder sectors, shipping and aviation.
Definitely harder. And there are barriers across transport, technological dependencies on battery production and charging infrastructure, the need for supportive regulations and urban planning, social and cultural factors influencing travel behavior, and significant investment shortfalls in public transport and charging infrastructure.
Lots of hurdles there, too. Finally, let's discuss the building sector, where we all live and work. Heating, cooling, lighting.
The benchmarks for the building sector call for a significant increase in the rates of deep energy retrofitting of existing buildings to improve their efficiency.
Fixing up old, leaky buildings.
Yes, making them use less energy. And ensuring that all new buildings constructed from now on are designed and built to operate at net zero carbon emissions.
All new buildings, zero carbon. That's a high bar.
It is. And unfortunately, progress in this sector is also currently off track in most parts of the world.
Off track here, too. Where's the potential?
The main areas of mitigation potential include avoiding energy demand through better design and insulation in the first place, constructing highly energy-efficient new buildings, undertaking comprehensive energy retrofits of existing building stock, and transitioning to more efficient appliances and heating and cooling systems like heat pumps.
Better design, better insulation, better appliances, heat pumps.
Okay. It covers the whole life cycle.
It sounds like we have a pretty clear picture of what needs to happen across all these sectors.
Yeah.
The recurring theme seems to be that the technology and many of the solutions exist. But the real challenge is implementation at the necessary speed and scale. Now, all of these transformations are going to require significant investment in financial flows. What does the report tell us about the financial aspects of bridging the emissions gap?
Absolutely, finance is critical. Transitioning from a high-carbon to a low-carbon global economy demands a substantial and rapid increase in investment. Global climate-related investments did reach a record high of around US $1.3 trillion per year in 2021 and 2022.
1.3 trillion. That sounds like a lot.
It is a lot, and the vast majority, about US $1.2 trillion, was directed towards mitigation efforts. However, the report clearly points out that there are still significant and widening investment gaps in key sectors, particularly in AFLU, that agriculture and land use sector we just talked about,
Read the big funding gap there.
and also in the industrial sector. Much more capital needs to be directed to these areas.
So the total amount is big, but it's not necessarily flowing to all the right places yet.
Exactly. And it's not just about the total amount of investment, but also critically about where that investment is flowing geographically, isn't it?
The developed versus developing country issue.
Precisely. The report strongly emphasizes the crucial need for a massive increase in climate-related investments in emerging market and developing economies, EMDEs, outside of China.
Why specifically outside China?
Well, China has seen significant domestic investment, but many other EMDEs are lagging far behind. These investments are not just about reducing global emissions, they are fundamentally linked to achieving sustainable development, fostering long-term economic growth, improving energy access, and lowering energy costs in these regions.
So it's a development issue as much as a climate issue for these countries.
Absolutely. Currently, these EMDEs are significantly underfunded in terms of climate investment. They receive only a small fraction, around 13.5% of total global mitigation investment.
Only 13.5%. That's tiny.
Tiny. The report estimates that an 8 to 16-fold increase in mitigation investment will be needed in these regions by 2030 to align with climate goals and sustainable development pathways.
8 to 16 times increase needed by 2030. That's a staggering increase needed for those economies. What are the main barriers that are currently hindering this flow of investment to EMDEs? Why isn't the money flowing?
Several significant challenges exist. These include a lack of clear and consistent policy frameworks that provide investor certainty. If the rules keep changing, investors get nervous.
Policy risk.
Right. The presence of financially strained public utilities that may be seen as risky counterparties for long-term contracts. A high cost of capital in many developing countries, it's just more expensive to borrow money. And often lower institutional capacities to develop and implement complex clean energy projects.
So policy uncertainty, risky partners, expensive borrowing, and lack of local capacity. A tough mix.
It is. The report highlights that enhanced and more ambitious NDCs can play a vital role in overcoming these barriers by sending clear and credible policy signals that can attract both domestic and international private investment.
So stronger national plans can help unlock finance.
Yes, they signal commitment. Effective leadership within these countries, coupled with strong international collaboration to de-risk investments and provide technical assistance, are also crucial for creating a more favorable environment for sustainable investment.
So it's a combination of having clear policy signals, demonstrating strong country leadership, and actively working to overcome those underlying structural barriers that are preventing the necessary finance from flowing.
Yeah.
What are some of the key elements that the report suggests would make future NDCs more effective in actually attracting this needed investment?
Yeah, the report emphasizes several key elements. Future NDCs need to be explicitly designed to enhance investment by creating stable and predictable regulatory environments. That's number one.
Stable rules.
They need to outline clear strategies for scaling up finance through innovative mechanisms, including public-private partnerships and green bonds.
How to actually get the money.
Right. Ensuring a just transition that considers the social and economic impacts of decarbonization is also crucial for building broad support and attracting investment that benefits local communities. You can't leave people behind.
The just transition part.
Very important. And as we discussed, directly addressing structural barriers like the high cost of capital and policy uncertainties is paramount. And finally, the report highlights the significant value of international knowledge exchange on effective policies and financial instruments. What's worked elsewhere? Countries can learn a great deal from each other's experiences.
Learning from successes and failures. Okay, so to bring it all together then, after this really in-depth look at the Emissions Gap Report 2024, what would you say is the most critical takeaway message for you, our listener?
You know, the central challenge that continues to stand out is this persistent and frankly alarmingly large gap between where our current greenhouse gas emissions are heading and where they absolutely need to be to meet the fundamental goals of the Paris Agreement, limiting global warming to well below 2 and ideally to 1.5 degrees Celsius.
The gap is still huge.
It's huge. And this gap persists despite the fact that, as the report highlights again and again, we already possess many of the necessary technologies to make significant emissions reductions. The urgent imperative really is for drastically accelerated action and a quantum leap in ambition in the next round of nationally determined contributions. We simply cannot afford further delays.
A quantum leap in ambition. That says it all. It certainly feels like we've covered a lot of crucial information today, really digging into the complexities laid out in this important report. And it leaves you, the listener, with a significant question to consider. Given the clear techno-economic potential to drastically cut emissions and the fairly well-understood barriers, policy, finance, institutions that are currently holding us back, what single factor do you believe holds the greatest power to truly unlock the necessary transformations and finally bridge this persistent emissions gap? Is it a fundamental shift in government policy? A massive mobilization of public and private finance? A profound societal shift in values and consumption patterns? Or maybe something else entirely? It's definitely a question worth pondering. And if you're interested in exploring this topic in even greater detail, we strongly encourage you to delve into the full Emissions Gap Report 2024 for a more comprehensive understanding of the data and analysis. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.